You're listening to Product-Led Revenue, brought to you by Correlated. In each episode, you'll hear firsthand advice and tactics from SaaS, sales, and revenue leaders about using product signals to drive expansion and revenue growth. Let's jump in.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Product-Led Revenue. I'm Breezy Beaumont, and this episode is brought to you by Correlated, a customer expansion platform for B2B software companies that focus on product-led growth. Today, our guest is Josh Wetzel, Chief Revenue Officer at OneSignal. So Josh, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Breezy, for having me. I'm excited.
All right, so to give our audience some background on yourself, can you tell us about your role at OneSignal?
I'm always trying to figure that out myself. No, it's really focused on growth. I think that's the name of the game, right? For everybody is how do you grow the business, and I'm tasked with that. So I focused on oversee sales, marketing, customer success, business development, but ultimately looking at like how does the business scale? How do we continue to grow faster? How do I continue to evolve and grow the team? And it's been fun. I mean, I've sort of my whole career has been kind of building up, doing more of this and growing businesses, and it's a great place to be.
Awesome. And for anyone who doesn't know what OneSignal is, do you mind just giving a little background on what OneSignal does and what problem you all are helping to solve?
I'm not even plugging. God, I mean, how can I be in growth and sales and not be plugging? Yeah, OneSignal is used by about 1.4 million companies around the globe. It's a customer messaging platform. Our core strength, our original product was push notifications and in-app messaging, and we've in the last couple of years expanded to incorporate and support SMS and email, and so the omni-channel journey. We have a web-based product that's very popular and used by about 70+% of all websites that do push use OneSignal. But our core of the business and the strength of it is really in mobile. We've got several 100,000 fairly sizable active mobile apps that use the product globally. So it's that's really what we do is deliver customer messaging.
Awesome. And so I know OneSignal's a product-led company, of course. You guys have that Get Started Now button on the website. So can you walk me through what that looks like when someone clicks that button, and what level of access do they get to your product? Are there any limitations for them once they get started?
Yeah, at our core, we want to provide the best product possible, and we want to provide a free entry point. We want anybody, if you and I wanted to create a side project or a mobile app or a website, we want people to be able to deploy this and have it and start building a customer list and loyalty right out of the gate. And so we have a really robust free product. So when you click that Get Started Now, you get to a place to quickly sign up. You can set up the application either on a website using some basic JavaScript, or there's some plugins like WordPress plugins, whatnot. Or on the mobile side, we have a bunch of different wrappers for the various mobile languages to easily drop this in. It takes about 15 to 30 minutes max to set it up. And our goal is to, turn every visitor into a user. Ultimately, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but our goal ultimately is turn every visitor into an evangelist in the product. And I think you start that by giving a really great initial experience where it's easy to set up, easy sign up, easy setup, and easy to get going, easy to get some value.
Awesome. Are there different companies have different ways of putting like levels inside of their product, right? So sometimes that's restricting certain features, or maybe it's just usage-based leveling of how much access you can get to the product. How do you all set that up on the paywall side? Like, is there, limited usage on, mobile versus on the website, or what does that look like for you all?
Yeah, it comes from the mantra of our founders, and we firmly believe at our core value that as I mentioned, we want to provide the best free product possible. So we differentiate around more advanced functionality, so personalization, the segmentation components. So if you want to be able to do a ton of automation, and when I say a ton, just like you want to do some of the more sophisticated things like building welcome sequences or segmenting audiences more than a little bit, more than a couple times, that's where you hit these paywalls. And that's really been, it's been nice for us. So it's less about usage and it's much more about the sophistication we want to put in the product. What I like about it personally is I think when companies are starting to get to that point where they want to use a little bit more of this functionality and get more value of the product, they're more likely able to pay. And the cost, like the core cost for us as a business, sits there because that's where the large computational power comes in. Versus just delivering messages isn't that difficult. So at our core, we differentiate around personalization, segmentation, automation kind of functionality. On the web-based stuff, we do have a limitation around total users. So if you want to send messages to more than 15,000 users, you'd have to pay to do it at one time. You can segment, a few buckets and be able to still send messages to quite a few users for free.
Got it. Very cool. Do you have, ideas around the number of people who are signing up monthly, or how many total users you have? I mean, it sounds fairly expansive, the number of
Yeah,
people who are using your product.
it's been incredible. I've worked on a lot of great products before, but this one in particular, for a B2B product, it's almost like a consumer application. So we're getting hundreds, north of sometimes, we average probably somewhere between 800 to 1,000 new signups a day. And, we've
Wow.
actually seen some acceleration, like on an absolute ratio or percentage basis. It's not as fast as say 2 years ago, but on an absolute number of users, it's actually grown faster. And I think the pandemic's had something to do with that. So we get a ton of usage. And again, it's because, you can do searches for the product. A lot of positive commentary out there. We get a ton of positive reviews. Developers love us. So it's the natural place that they start with their projects on. A lot of small business, medium businesses, marketers, like anyone that gets exposed to it. So we get a ton of people coming into the product that way. And it's a pleasure because it makes my job a lot easier when you've got so much inbound interest and positive sentiment out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's the true product-led way, but I mean, that's amazing that you're having thousands of new people coming in every day. That's wild. How do you manage all of that data coming in? Are all of those folks going into your CRM? How are you routing those to your team? Do you mind diving in a little bit to how that process works?
Yeah, we have two channels. We have the self-serve signups, right? People that are just coming in and signing up, wanting to use the product. And those people go into our back end because they become a user of the product. We do enrichment on each one of those. So we're looking at, who is the person, what's the org, what's their likely use case. We're trying to discern, sort of role and to create experience a journey for them that's going to be unique relative to where they probably sit in the org, what they think about. We have some unique challenges. So with that many great users signing up, it's awesome, but it's also it's almost evenly distributed across the globe. So we do have some language considerations, and we try to keep it simple to take into consideration how many people are coming from different places and their grasp of the language or their technical grasp. Some people are really, really technical. Some people aren't. So that's the self-serve. That's the people that are signing up to use the product. We also have, a dozen or a few dozen or somewhere on the order of dozens, but not hundreds of kind of what we consider like traditional sales leads. So contact us where they're asking to have a conversation. And we get a lot of noise in that as well because you get so many people using the product. So sometimes it's support oriented. Most of the time, though, it's somebody who's legitimately interested in the product and wants to talk to them. And so we do the same process of enriching. Those go directly into our CRM. And I just missed. So when people sign up and they meet certain metrics based on the enrichment, they get put into the CRM as well. And they get put into a journey sequence, leveraging kind of more of the sales driven process. If they don't hit that marker, they're just in a traditional journey on educating them, right? Like it goes back to the turning every visitor into an evangelist. I don't care if you're a single person blogger that's never going to have more than 500 people on your website, or you're, a business insider or whatnot. Like we care deeply about having a great experience for each one of those folks, but we want to provide more dedication of resources and focus on the business insiders of the world than the individual blogger. So we basically take a similar process in terms of how we enrich. And we're trying to funnel everybody that makes sense based on size, need, and or inquiry into a conversation with a human. And so one of the things we've had to do is both system around enrichment, but we've also had to probably expand internationally faster than a company would normally. We're about 100 people, and we have now people focused on, we actually have people either based or directly focused on 4 continents. And so that's required us to be thoughtful about both resourcing, but also systems and tools.
Yeah. Speaking of tools, what is your tech stack look like?
Yeah, so we on the back end's obviously our core product, and we actually use our product in part of this in the journey. And then we have our core CRM, which we push everything on the business side into Salesforce. And then off of Salesforce, that triggers both like broad-based marketing emails off of Marketo. We trigger basic emails, or we trigger rep-based or like individual one-to-one emails off of Outreach. And then we use some different data tools on the enrichment side, some home built, some purchased, and we've reused a ton of providers, and I think they're all really good. Whether it's Clearbit or ZoomInfo, they all have their advantages. I think for our business in particular, it's so noisy because we get so many people from countries that, no offense to any data provider, but they're just not collecting data in a lot of these countries. They may be really solid countries, but they're small, or they're in Asia, or they're South America or Eastern Europe. And so our coverage is pretty weak. And so that provides that creates some of the what I like to think of as opportunity, but it's ultimately a challenge. But I don't know if that gives you the sense of the stack. I mean, we use a bunch of little tools. Internally, we're Slack for all internal communication, and then we leverage Slack as a communication hub to trigger stuff around activity around a lead, or if somebody comes in, somebody interacts with a module or a conversation, that triggers stuff into groups so that everyone's kind of aware of, and people can pick up the conversation and keep the ball rolling forward.
And what are those key? One of the things you just touched on is interesting to me. So what are those key actions that people are taking in your product that are interesting to you all? So it sounds like you're using those key actions to notify folks in Slack and to maybe kick off some routing in Outreach and kick off some sequences over there. But what are some of those, points for you that are really interesting for your team and great opportunities for your team to reach out?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're evolving every day. So to say we figured it out or we're great here would be disingenuous. But we have spent quite a bit of time looking at those inflection points of like when you set up this or you do this, it's a high likelihood that you're going towards that sophistication. Or we look at how many subscribers, so how many customers people are adding to their contacts. Messages sent. So it's really activity-based stuff that will trigger. In fact, that's a big part of our lead enrichment lead scoring. As we score like an individual or account, the more activity they're doing in terms of logging in, sending messages, setting up automations, that grows the value in our eyes of the opportunity with that customer. And quite frankly, what the way I think about it is almost less about sales and more about how do we enhance the customer experience. It's a leading indicator that they're invested in the product and they need more support, need more help, and want to make sure they get there versus trying to do the brute force of like, let me go reach out to this customer or prospective customer who's not showing any indication that they're really engaged. They might have just signed up to test it out. They might have, or they might not be part of the core team using the product. And so we use that activity as a heavy part of the lead scoring process.
That makes sense. And did you always have, PQL scoring from the beginning, or is that something that sort of came along the way? And I guess on top of that question, I'd have to assume it probably got iterated on over the years a few times.
Oh, it's getting iterated on every day. Or maybe not every day, but like I would say it's definitely at least monthly. No, we basically we had really rudimentary lead scoring about 18 months ago, which is what we rolled out. It had very little activity based. It had really rudimentary activity. It was really based on, domain of the person, the company the person's coming from, and a few other factors that we were looking at. And look, I think one of the things that is really important in any one of these organizations, but it's been really critical for us because we have so many users and there's a lot of noise in the system, is you've got to have great ops and kind of business intelligence. We have a data scientist who's focused around this as well. Those resources are gold for a business like ours. I think I've been in more traditional enterprise motions as well, so I've seen kind of both sides. Enterprise is a lot easier in many ways. Like, I hate to say that, but it's true. You're dealing with a lot less leads. There's a lot less noise. It's hard to go get that interest, but each interest is there. The lead scoring is like, in my experience, is pretty rudimentary. It's like, we've got this person, this title, this size of company, this revenue. Like, we're going to weight this more than that person. In our world, most of the people that we're trying to enrich, we don't necessarily know the company they came from. Actually, I'd say like 50% of the time we know the company, but I would say I don't know the exact percentage, but it's a small number, minority, where we know the role. So we don't really have a good sense of, like, is this a day-to-day? Is this an implementer? Is this an executor? And that creates challenges around the journey. So I think there's pros and cons of both. Like, I really love having all this noise. It's great, like, intellectual stuff. But anyhow, the core point I would say is that, like, the stack is really important, but also having the right people who can make wind of that. And so we've really iterated. Our lead scoring's come a long way in the last 6 months, in terms of adding a lot more activity based. And we kind of had to pivot, by the way, a little bit, just to close the loop on this, because we don't have all North America or Western Europe leads, and it's relatively straightforward to go enrich them with, like, company and title. We had to be much more thoughtful about what are the other factors and data we could bring to bear to make a better determination. And so that's why we've driven a lot from the product usage.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone there in kind of it being like a constant challenge and constantly tweaking it. I've talked to folks, at much smaller companies, and I've talked to folks at some of the leading PLG companies like yourselves, and I think it sounds like it's constantly being tweaked. People's PQL scoring models, and what are those important actions, and if we're layering on multiple actions, what's the layering of, trying this feature and clicking this button and logging in X amount of times? Should they be logging in 3 times or 5 times? I think all of the layering of this data, and then obviously also bringing in, firmographic or demographic data on top of that. It sounds like it's a challenge that, people are always iterating on. And I think it's actually sort of the same way that people are always shifting, their MQL or SQL scoring models as well, maybe less often, just because, you don't have as much to work off of. So it's more limited, but, I think it's a constant challenge for pretty much every company out there.
One of the coolest things, kind of, not to digress, but, as somebody who's been around the internet now for 20 plus years, 20 years ago, we were working in such small scale in general. Like, if you had, on your consumer side, if you had 5 or 10 million, like literally 20 years ago, if you had 20 million monthly unique visitors, you were like a top web property, you were publicly traded, and, like, people were going crazy. Now we've got customers who've got 100 million, like, monthly active users, like, monthly active, or like 5-10 million daily active, mobile subs. And I've never even heard of some of these businesses, so the expansion and the growth globally, the adoption and sort of the digitalization, if you will, of the global economy has been remarkable. And it provides these opportunities and quite frankly, these intellectual challenges that are fun to tackle, that we just didn't have 20 years ago. So.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty wild. I'd love to also dig into your team a little bit. So, how big is your team over there? I know you said you're responsible for customer success, sales. So if you could just dive into, how many players you have there, how have you been working out that, which team is responsible for which parts of converting and expanding and success of your customers, dive into your team a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So the company's 100. The total around, kind of, the go-to-market side, so sales, marketing, customer success is about 40. And sales, like quota carrying reps and kind of leadership there is 18 as of today. I believe it's 18.
Nice.
And we've got a handful of open roles. We're constantly hiring there. We've got 4 on the customer success side. So that's a function that we actually, quite frankly, we were slow to build, partly because their product was super easy to set up. But we've been growing that quite a bit this year, and we'll continue to grow it. And then we've got on the marketing side. So we've combined. We actually didn't invest in SDR, kind of BDR resources until this year. And I'm happy to talk about that later if it's interesting. But as you can imagine, being PLG, we kind of felt like we had plenty of leads, and what we found was investing in that was smart now, because we wanted to qualify and convert and make sellers more efficient and start doing outbound. So that team sits within marketing because they're really trying to do qualification and partnering with demand gen. And so that team is 4 today. And then the broader marketing team is 7. So the marketing team as a whole is call it 11. And then BD is a handful, and that's basically the org is, it's basically a little bit less than 10. I think it's 8 between 7 between BD and customer success. It's 12 in marketing, and then 18 on the sales side. So we're trying to hire pretty much everywhere. I mentioned this briefly. We're US based, but we've got we're headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area in San Mateo. But we've got a nice size office, coming up on a dozen people in New York City. And we've got almost 10 now in London. I've got a couple people in APAC based in Singapore. And then we've got a couple people remote in Texas that we started hiring this year as well. So it's a pretty broad team, and we intentionally did that to be able to attack and have resources that are kind of more follow the sun and there with near customers, so that we can help them be successful.
Smart. Yeah, you hitting all the time zones too, as well, so then you can help around the clock.
What's crazy is if you look at the first time I looked at our analytics, looking at usage, just the website and the application, the vast majority of our usage, only 20, just to give you some perspective, about 26% of our usage is in North America. And so if you look at the usage chart, it's vast majority of usage happens between about 11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So you have a lion's share of this, APAC, Europe, that hits, and even South America. Before this job, I didn't quite realize how far further on the time zones they were. I think the core of Brazil is like 6 hours ahead of the West Coast even. So it's crazy.
Yeah. And how did you, split out the function? I think one thing that product-led companies struggle with a lot is, what is the role of, CS versus sales versus marketing? And I think probably the biggest crossover there is CS and sales, because you hire sales teams that are presumably more, customer focused, the consultative sales, as people are calling it. And so how have you been able to determine, who owns which parts of the process? And I'm particularly curious about expansion revenue, if there's someone who has a quota for that on one of those 2 teams.
Yeah. So try to make this as concise as possible. We started off, we were very transactional. The product itself is 6-ish plus years old and has a ton of scale. The commercial effort really started a little less than 3 years ago. When I started a little more than 3 years ago, we didn't have formal SaaS pricing. We didn't have a sales team. We had a couple of people that were helping do deals, but we didn't really have a form. We didn't have like a standard, sort of scaled contract or like any of that stuff. So we rolled that out in that fall. And the initial sales was very transactional oriented. We would do some really large deals, like with bigger companies that had embedded us deeply into their product. But the vast majority of the deals were kind of traditional mid-market. And so for the first 18 months, we were scaling the sales team, and they owned end to end. And we actually didn't have, as I mentioned earlier, we had virtually no customer success resources. We hired a couple of people early on, but they were really roamers, and they're much more about farming and being the consultant, kind of messaging evangelist, if you will, for those companies, and particularly at the very large size, because we have some really large customers that have embedded us deeply into their experiences. And so over time, we basically got to this point where I think today customer success holds a goal. They have a book. So each member has a let's call it 20, 25, 30 accounts with several $1 million. They're tasked with growing that, so retaining and growing it. And they have a plan against that. Any expansion dollars, like new ARR dollars, there's an AE that gets comped for it as well. So there's a rep that would come in. And so really expansion overall, like net new and expansion is consumed in the traditional sales team today. For the larger accounts, there's a customer success person who's thinking about it as well and gets comped on it. And then we've got we're starting to play with a renewals team that's kind of an overlay for the rest of the business, where that person is responsible for expanding, retaining first and foremost, and expanding the broader base. One of the challenges we have, quite frankly, is there's this like pivot point. We have some really large customers, for example, that just start on our self-serve plan. They give us a credit card. And some of these are like Fortune 100 companies that are, divisions of. And so what we want to be mindful of is we want to push the customer to the right channel, right? Like self-serve, if this is going to be a small little engagement, they just want to play around, or that's just their preferred path. And so that's why one of the reasons why we started the SDR team in marketing, because we want them to be thoughtful about doing what's best for the customer. If a customer wants to be self-serve and credit card, sure. Whereas sales gets comped on the annual, traditional ARR contracts. And so we try to be mindful of that, and we want to make sure that sellers are constantly focused on helping customers find the right place. And so that's why we kind of give them expansion and focus on net new, but also try to have a gate in between a customer when someone comes in, you have a conversation, it's clear that they're not going to be big. We don't want to try to oversell them. We want to have them land in the right place for them for a sustainable relationship.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And as you were hiring on the sales folks over the years, were these folks who had previous product-led or self-serve or freemium experience, or what was that like? Sort of retraining the brain of some folks, because it is pretty different thinking about enterprise sales versus product led. There's definitely a ton of overlap, but as you mentioned, the quantity is way bigger, and it's less about poaching accounts and more about farming them or getting them involved in the product. So curious how your hiring went.
It's a great question, and I think that we could talk for hours actually just about hiring practice. Like, do you hire people from the industry with a ton of experience and they can land, and there's pros and cons to all of that. We early on, I was very mindful of hiring people that would fit our culture. We're a pretty unique company in respect to everyone's equal. So we're not Google, where like if you're not an engineer or a product manager, you sort of are a lower class in the company. And anyone at Google tells you that's not true is lying. Same thing at like a Facebook, obviously very different companies, but even on the cloud side, right? Like on Google Cloud. We're not Salesforce, where the sales team is like the dominant team and everyone else is kind of secondary. And anyone who tells you that's not true is lying to you. And so, but we truly do believe everyone's equal. I don't care if you're like, delivering food for us or your whatever role, everyone plays a role. And so we had to get people who are like thoughtful about that. And early on, we hired a couple people that were industry specific, and we hired a couple people who came from non-technical backgrounds. And what's interesting that I found at this job in particular, I think because there's so much hustle, because there's a global base and you're kind of dealing with so many different people and different walks of life, the people that perform the best actually have not come from a similar or even a SaaS background. They've come from another industry where they learned good work ethic. They just have the hustle. They're quick learners. So we've had great success hiring from like ad tech software. We've actually had a couple of people come from one person was selling at Tesla as an example. So we've had this like really nice, it's kind of random, but I think we found like, quite frankly, a couple of people that we brought in and then had to manage out, were from the industry per se, or came from like more PLG. But I don't necessarily know if, I think sometimes it's just a right place and right time, right? I think we've all, at least maybe not you, but we've all had situations where we landed a company and we're like, oh, maybe the culture is not right, or I'm tired of selling this same similar product in this category. And so they, after 9 months or a year, they're like, oh, I need to move on. So I think what we've done is where we've been successful, it's like hiring hungry people, who are, open, very thoughtful about being in a team and collaborative environment. But yeah, no, to answer your question, I mean, I can only think of one person we've hired that actually came from kind of more PLG directly from the industry, who's worked out like and performed. Um, all the other people who have kicked ass, and most of our quota achievement's been really strong, and the vast majority we hired have not come from the space. Part of it's been difficult, and our competitive set are either really, really enterprise centric, and or historically they've been in markets where we're not there, and we've wanted to hire either New York or Bay Area. Now we're going to London, but so I think that's also provided some of it. Like we've been forced to look at other industries and be creative. So.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly think it might be the right approach anyways. I mean, it sounds like you guys are going for sort of culture fit first on your hiring, but I
100%.
think it's such a different idea. Any role you're going to take at a product-led company it's going to be different if it's a product-led company, because marketing works differently and customer success works differently and product works differently, and everyone at the company understands the product way more than they do at more enterprise selling companies, or traditional sales led, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to go forward sort of with that, saying, we're hiring for a culture fit and for, that curiosity and that hungriness and that friendliness, kindness. It's actually similar to what we're doing over here at Correlated, but it's good to know you guys have been successful with it as well.
I think it's critical, quite frankly. I think people underrate it. If I look at some of the best companies I've worked at, or the ones that haven't worked out, like I always like to say, I've been very fortunate to work at some places I learned some, where we failed, and I learned some great lessons. But I think it's underrated. And I look at the best companies, like they have a very strong culture. It may not be a culture you love, but I mean, I kind of reference Salesforce. I think they have a really great, strong culture. Obviously Google, Facebook, Apple, like some of these companies, like large companies. But I think it's an underrated part of how do you build camaraderie, collaboration. How do you build a game plan that everyone's kind of on the same page with? I know you're from the New England area, Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots. I think that's an example though, where he sets an expectation culturally, and people will can conform to it, or they don't, and they're gone. But I think that's important for setting success, is having consistency there and not wavering. So.
Well, it certainly worked for the Patriots.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
I'm not anti. I'm him. Tom Brady grew up around here, so I'm pro. But I do think it's a good example that I think we can take in any industry, which is you've got to set an expectation and have consistency. That's how people are going to perform. And it's also an easy way to reference when people aren't performing. Like you're not fitting what our expectations are. And so where I've had my success, I think that's stronger, and as I've gotten further along my career, I've really brought that wherever I'm at, which is like, I conform and I adapt, because I'm not going to come in and be like, it's going to be this. But I think you have to really accentuate that, and you have to play it up, and you have to get consistency. And that's where people really buy in. So that's been great in respect to OneSignal. I think the culture that George and Long, our two founders, have set, and the expectations have been really, really good. And I think everybody who works here really appreciates that, quite frankly, particularly during the pandemic. It's been crazy. We're all remote. It's hard to be connected. And so doing things that are helping people feel like they're part of the team, part of the journey, are really, really key.
So I have a question for you that's burning a hole in my pocket.
Yeah.
Everyone loves to talk about pricing, and I think it's something that, similar to that, how we talked about, PQL score or any lead scoring system can, have different shifts over time. I'd be really curious to hear about how you all are thinking about pricing, or, usage based or seats based, or any thoughts or iterations you guys have had over the years on the pricing front.
Well, I'll start by saying, look, I've worked at, I won't call it out, but anyone who knows me knows what company this is. I've worked at a company publicly traded that did really well, a SaaS company that really messed up pricing. And it really hurt us actually with our core product, because you couldn't defend it. You go to a customer and you're like, hey, I'm going to charge you 400 grand. And they're like, well, I worked at, a competitor, and we had you, and it was the same size business, and I paid 75 grand. So why am I charging 400? It was like, there was no connection to it. So I think pricing is a really underrated part of go to market that if you get wrong, it's really difficult. For us, it was pretty straightforward. You could either charge on the number of contacts you have in the system, so what we call subscribers, because in our world, people have to opt in. We firmly believe in that, whether it's email, whether it's SMS, push. So it's a subscriber where we're actually collecting information and you can actually message them. And on the push side, we've always had unlimited usage. So some people will send, we literally have some people that send like a couple messages a year to all their base, but they're really important, like governments or municipalities, things like that, healthcare in some cases. And then we've got people like major sports leagues or media companies that are sending millions, if not 100+ million in a given day on a regular basis. So we went with contacts. So we call them subscribers. One of the things that's evolved over time, though, is as we've added new channels like SMS, it has to be message based. So we charge for the number of numbers you have that you're messaging that are messageable. And then we charge based on message total because you've got carrier costs. So we've had to augment over time as we've expanded the product. But I really like the pricing because I think it focuses on where, again, it goes back to what I said earlier about where we start charging. We also charge pricing on where the cost is. The cost is in the number of users you have. And because we're collecting information about, like, one of the things about a mobile first messaging is you know how frequently they're coming back to the app or the website, like device type, there's all sorts of nice cues you don't get in a traditional like email product that's not mobile based. But we're collecting a lot of information to allow you to segment and personalize. And so, without that ability, so that's where our costs are. So anyhow, we pass that along. But I can't stress pricing enough. It's something that we thought about a lot. We did a lot of research when I first got here around what we were going to do, how we would do it. And I think we landed in a really good place where it's synergistic for the customer and for where our costs lie and the value that's being created.
Awesome. And are there any, we're coming up on the end of the episode, so are there any changes that we should know about the product going forward, or any features or things we should be aware of?
No, I mean, we've announced most of the stuff. I would just leave it with, our focus is making the product easier to use. So whether it's setup, but it's also integration. So we've knocked out a ton of key integrations in our kind of core ecosystem. So Segment, Amplitude, Mixpanel, and more to come. Some of the CRMs, we have an investment from and an integration from HubSpot and from the spring. We've integration into and partnership with Unity on the mobile game side. So continue to expand around that. And then on the channel side, having all the channels talk together and kind of the journey, if you will, like the orchestration across those channels. That's where the industry is going. That's what customers need. That's what they're asking for. So we're continuing to build against that, and you'll see more integrations that make it easier to use the product and get value out of it. And you'll see more advancements around that orchestration component and just making the channels themselves more valuable. So.
Awesome. Well, where should people go to learn more about you or about OneSignal? What's the best way to learn about
There's no need to learn about me. But you can go to OneSignal, ONE signal.com, and you can learn more about the product. And I encourage you, if you've got a website, mobile app, you should turn this thing on. It's free. It's easy to use. You can start building audience. You're gonna grow your daily, kind of monthly, by like 10 to 30, 40% by turning this thing on. And so it's really, really direct ROI in terms of your experience. Even for my personal blog, I see it. So, and yeah, thank you, Breezy. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And it was great having you on Product-Led Revenue. Thanks again.
Thank you, Breezy.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Product-Led Revenue. This show is brought to you by Correlated, the first platform built for product-led revenue. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow the Product-Led Revenue podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit getcorrelated.com/podcast to get access to all of the latest episodes.